my pleasure to introduce to you this afternoon Sarah Roberts from the Ethical Tea Partnership. Sarah is the Executive Director of the Ethical Tea Partnership. She has over 2 decades of experience of development and corporate responsibility work, leading work and convening multi-stakeholder partnerships on important sustainability issues, ranging from living wage ones and sustainability to climate change. And prior to joining the Ethical Tea Partnership, she worked on educational projects in South Africa and spent 5 years at the International Institute for Environment and Development. And she's had experience of working in the not-for-profit sector and for large-scale consultancy firms. So she's absolutely the person to be speaking to you today. She's going to tell you a little bit about how the Ethical Tea Partnership operates, how it's evolved, how it maintains that critical momentum for getting work done, but also how the kinds of issues as an organisation like the Ethical Tea Partnership, how the kinds of issues it works on have to evolve over time, and the strategies that it uses to get traction in this really difficult area around global food supply chains, and what the role of the farmer is, and how those farmers can have secure livelihoods under conditions of sort of globalised food production, which of course is what tea is all about. And I think we might be really lucky enough to hear a little bit about Malawi as the case study. So please join me in welcoming Sarah to the IGP.
Well, thank you very much, and I have to say I was really delighted to get this invitation, because it's it really makes me think when I come and do these types of presentation, and thinking about how our work kind of chimes in with the themes and approaches that you're looking at in IGP was actually really, really instructive. And so what I want to do today is as Henrietta says, just explain a bit about the work that we do at the Ethical Tea Partnership. I will look back a bit at where the Ethical Tea Partnership came from and how it's evolved, because I think that is really instructive to look at how this agenda is changing, how the pressures that are driving change are changing, and then give you some examples of how we're trying to move forward on issues and how that's changed over the last 20 years. And I was going to contrast the situations we're dealing with in 2 quite important tea growing areas, Malawi and India, and explain why we're working somewhat differently in those countries. But as you can see, I mean, our mission is to achieve a tea industry that's socially just and environmentally sustainable, which I think is a big part of what you're looking at globally in the Global Prosperity Institute. And I again, looking at your websites, there was a lot about how you drive partnerships and how you start new conversations about actually what does prosperity look like in the world that we're living in now. And while I just work in tea, those are very much the issues that we're grappling with in one sector. So I hope the themes that come out resonate with you, and I certainly won't talk for an hour. I hope that you've got lots of questions and maybe some ideas. I'll tell you about some of the things that we are really up against in some of the programs that we're leading. But I thought it would be instructive to go look back, because I've run the Ethical Tea Partnership for nearly 10 years now, but it goes back well beyond before me. And it was set up by a group of tea companies, a small group of leading tea companies, ones you probably will have heard of, big brands, Tetley, Unilever, which owns PG Tips, Taylor's Paragot, which is owns Yorkshire Tea, Twinings. And I think the conversations started happening back in 1995, and they came about when these companies were being asked questions, or were asking questions internally about whether they were sourcing ethically, and whether they, what the conditions were like in the countries and the communities they were sourcing from. And if you talk to the people who some of whom are still on the board when I joined, they were very honest. Back in 1995, they couldn't answer those questions. But what I think is really interesting about the tea industry is, even back in 1995, they made a very strategic decision that this was not an area to go for comparative advantage on. That if you're going to try and engage in these issues and really think about what ethical sourcing meant, you needed to do it collaboratively. And now that's kind of the norm now. If you look at what's happened in the last 20 years, you've got the roundtable on soy and palm, you've got cotton, you've got the Global Coffee Platform. There's loads of those organisations. But back in 1995, there absolutely weren't. And that is one of, when I took the job, my background before I came into I knew nothing about tea when I took the job. It was in my background, as you heard, was in development and corporate responsibility. One of the reasons I took the job was because I could see that there was this long history of companies collaborating. And they did that for lots of reasons, but one of the reasons why, when I came into the job, I thought we had real potential for change is because those companies, the buying companies, were used to collaborating. They're huge competitors in the market. We're on ethical sourcing issues, they were used to collaborating. There's a lot of overlap in supply as well. So that's one of the reasons that collaboration was quite effective, because people, in many cases, are buying from the same suppliers. And they were wanting to make sure they were giving the same messages to suppliers. Generally, it should be more cost effective for them if they're working together. So there were lots of good reasons about why to collaborate, but that wasn't the norm in other sectors. I mean, we had a huge focus at that time on things like garments and shoes, and all those big brands back in the 90s were doing their own audit programs, their own sourcing, supplier sourcing standards. But that is where the Ethical Tea Partnership started. It started by organising audits. There was very little experience of social audit back in the 90s, and there was some Fairtrade, but very little actually in tea at that time. And so the early part of the ETP's history was all about organising audits, with the assumption that if you organised independent audits to a good standard, you would understand what was going on, and by understanding, then those problems would be solved. So, that was actually much harder, I think, than they anticipated. People would be very honest that it wasn't an easy process. They didn't get quite enough engagement and buy-in from the producers they were auditing. So, lots of people were very honest about kind of what worked and what didn't. Same time, there was a huge drive on certification generally on agricultural commodities, so particularly Rainforest Alliance certification was really ramping up. And so, tea, like coffee, like cocoa, is a very heavily audited sector. Consequently, we learned a huge amount from that process, but consequently, we do not do audit anymore. We've decided to step out of that space. Rainforest Alliance, Fairtrade will still be in that space. We've seen where it can work, but we've absolutely also seen the limits of what an audit program and certification program can do. So from all that learning, that early phase on audit, our organisation has changed actually quite radically. And our focus is on convening the industry, and so obviously we bring together our members. These are our members. We bring together now over 50 companies, and these are the companies that buy tea. They buy, they source, they retail tea. We bring them together with the rest of the supply chain and development partners and NGOs and expert implementers to try and actually move forward change on the ground. And as you can see, the kind of issues we're grappling with are a range, but very linked to prosperity. Tea is grown across parts of Asia, so we work in China, India, Indonesia, Sri Lanka are the main ones in Asia. In the other part of the globe where tea is a really important crop is East Africa, East and Central Africa, so Kenya is a very, very major exporter of tea, Malawi, Tanzania and Uganda. And these are very different countries with very different economic circumstances. In some places conditions are good. In other places, generally either because the country itself is extremely poor, for example Malawi, or if you look at some regions of richer countries like India, some regions like Assam, which is a major tea growing area in India, because of the history, because of the particular circumstances of those regions, you have people who are quite vulnerable, where incomes are low, and the development indicators are really poor. And so those are the issues that we are particularly grappling with, alongside a whole range of issues to do with environmental change and climate change, as you might expect if you're dealing with an agricultural crop. So that's kind of a very, very brief history of kind of where we've come from and what we're focused on now. And so what I just thought I would explain a bit is kind of how we're framing our strategy, how we've been framing our strategy probably over the last 5 years, and kind of where I see it evolving. So we do take a huge amount. We have been framing our strategy for quite a while with a lot of respect to originally the Millennium Development Goals, now the Sustainable Development Goals, and we do that for a number of reasons. One, because obviously Sustainable Development Goals are absolutely there for a reason. Those are the development indicators that really do matter across the globe. It's a framework that people recognise. There's government processes around the SDGs. There's some variably good data, but it helps to be able to put things in context. It is something that companies are really thinking about now and wanting to report against. So that framework's quite helpful for us. And then obviously we now have, and perhaps this is something also I needed to get across, so one of the big shifts that the Ethical Tea Partnership made before I was hired, but it was the shift that I was part of really moving forward, was going from an organisation which was all about checking things to an organisation that was all about helping to solve things. And to do that, we need people on the ground. So before I came in, the board, who were all members of buying companies, had organised to hire a number of team members in tea-growing countries, and that's a trend that's massively continued now. And so we have teams of people, particularly in places like India and Malawi, some of whom have got backgrounds in tea. They're people who really used to run estates in some cases, so really can get the confidence of the producers, and lots of other people with community development and different kinds of development experience. So we have people on the ground who can really help us understand the realities on the ground, and then the risks in the supply chain and the risks to our members. And we then try and take a really clear analysis of the situation that we see in key sourcing countries, and there's sufficient value going to workers and farmers that they can live a decent life. And these are people who are being paid absolutely legally. In Malawi, everything's probably triply certified, Fairtrade, Rainforest Alliance, boots, so people are being paid legally. But actually, when we did an analysis with Oxfam back in 2013, when lots of concerns were being raised about so-called poverty wages, one of the areas where we found that people were really below World Bank benchmarks was in Malawi. So it's a very interesting and quite very challenging country for us, because people, as I said, people are being paid legally, they're being paid very close to average wages in Malawi, but actually if you look at the development stats and you look at how they come against World Bank indicators, it's very poor. And that does mean that when you do the analysis of farmers and of workers, we will find farmers and workers in those supply chains will be going hungry at certain times of the year. And that is generally true for smallholder farmers in a lot of agricultural export crops. There is a very large proportion of people in agriculture, smallholder agricultural export crops, who are still going hungry at times of the year. And that's one of the things I'm seeing different sectors really trying to think much more carefully about is, why is it that sufficient value is not getting down to farmers and workers? And why can we not have what's now being described as nutritionally secure supply chains? And actually there's some very big economic issues behind that, which even these kinds of collaborations find quite difficult to solve. But if you just contrast that a little bit with India is actually a massive producer of tea, so 25, almost a quarter of world production. But obviously India is a very different kind of country to Malawi, and it's comparatively much richer. Assam, where a lot of tea is grown, has again quite core development indicators and a number of issues, sanitation being one, which is something I was just talking to Henrietta about. But even though it's a very large it's a very large tea producer, it's not particularly important to India as a whole. It's massive though in terms of scale, in terms of number of people involved, probably around between 1 and 2 million are connected in some way to the Indian tea industry. But it's mostly a crop that is produced for the internal market. So whereas in Malawi it's mainly an export crop, in India it's mainly a local crop. And so most of the buying is done in India for Indian consumption. And so the influence and leverage that Western buyers have is actually very, very limited in India. I think only less than 2% of Indian tea comes to the UK. And so there's lots of concerns about certain issues in India, which are very high on the agenda for my member companies. But it's much harder to get the right kind of has been much harder to have some of the right kinds of conversations in India because the concerns of Pakistani buyers or Russian buyers or are different, and that's where more of the crop is going. We've got again all sorts of challenges in those countries, but we are working in rather different ways. So if we go back to 2013 when we did this study with Oxfam, and we saw some really difficult issues coming out about the fact that tea workers were being paid legally. These were certified producers. In most cases at the time, now I think pretty much all of them who were involved in the study would be certified. But actually, the level of income that people were taking home was not up with the World Bank benchmarks of what you would need for a decent life. There was quite a reasonable amount of campaigning going on about trying to change this. But the big question is how? How can you go through the process of trying to achieve living wage or living income in an economy that is very poor and has a lot of other challenges? And how can we do that without destabilising the industry and making it uncompetitive against its peers? Those are the big challenges, the ones that we're grappling with all the time. But because Malawi is primarily an export industry, and because there were particular concerns about it, and because we felt that we really could bring together the major buyers for Malawi, we have taken quite an innovative approach there. We've signed a memorandum of understanding with all these tea buyers, with all the tea producers in Malawi, with development partners, the German GIZ, IDH, which is the Dutch development partner, with Oxfam, about working together to find ways of raising incomes for farmers and workers whilst keeping the industry competitive. And it's been really, really hard because Malawi's got incredibly high inflation. It's had devaluations. It's got a difficult tax situation. There's all sorts of issues around exchange rates, which makes this whole process of how do you steadily try and raise wages without destabilising the industry particularly difficult. One of the things Matthew asked me to do is to give some examples of the type of levels we're operating in. And so with the Malawi 2020 programme, we've got a whole stream of work that partners are working on around the competitiveness of the industry. How can they make sure they are fit for the future, that they're producing tea that the market is going to want in the longer term? How can they make sure that they're efficient and that they can replant tea so that they've got the varieties that are needed for the future? So a whole range of work on the competitiveness side, whole range of work on the smallholder farming side, which is a very important component. A whole range of work on workers, and then a range of work around procurement practices, so how buyers are buying tea. We have a model that we've developed to look at the value that is going into the market, and therefore to try and calculate what is appropriate in terms of targets for raising wages. And then there's an awful lot of very very interesting and often quite difficult discussion. So every year we all go to Malawi, we take all the tea buyers with us, we meet the producers. It looks like we're having a really nice time by the pool there. But if you can see any of these quite small photos, you might see people looking a bit tired because the day before there's been some incredibly intense essentially negotiations about what is possible, what is doable, how can more value reach workers and farmers, whilst making sure these producers have viable businesses, and what are the buyers prepared to pay for that. And those are the kind of discussions that are now being had in these kind of forums, and then in all sorts of forums around it. And obviously we have to be incredibly mindful of competition law. So it is quite a cutting edge program, but it isn't easy. So we've got those kind of things going on. Then, again, this was some pictures from the field trip. So we do then take them out to see actually a whole range of other work that's happening on the ground, because you've got these structural discussions essentially. But then actually, if you want to change farmer incomes, it's partly about the price the market's paying, and it's partly whether the tea's going into the right kind of blends, but it's also about how productive they are, how good they are at producing their tea, how they manage their input costs, all those things. So we do a huge amount of work, training work directly with farmers, which if you go back kind of 5 years, that was probably the mainstay of what we were doing. Lots and lots of projects on the ground to raise quality, raise productivity, make sure people have better business skills, all those kind of things. And that is still a very important part of what we do. Then there's a whole range of other things around that. I know I've listened to some of Henrietta's programs. We do a lot of work on gender-based issues which come through in all sorts of ways. And actually, if you can work well with women and empower women, and then look at what kind of budgets are coming to the women, give women other opportunities for having their own income. So we do a lot of work with peer-to-peer lending schemes, for example. We do a lot of work around skilling up women to be able to take on more opportunities themselves. That is another way we see household income actually going on to basic needs, onto education, onto the things that help drive society. And then, as you can see, there's a whole range of we take people around to see solar lighting and things like that, because actually if you look at another aspect of Malawi, huge environmental crisis there, massive deforestation, that's affecting the watershed, it's affecting the climate. It's also affecting people's lives because they're still totally reliant on firewood. If there's no firewood, you are very well open to exploitation if you need to go and collect it. So doing things like having a whole scheme on clean cook stoves, which is reducing the need for firewood, and you've got women entrepreneurs now producing them, has all sorts of knock-on benefits, from environmental benefits to income benefits to health benefits to reducing gender-based violence benefits. And I think that's been one of the learnings, is how do you integrate these kind of programs and look at the totality of how you change people's lives. I guess the other thing that Matthew, when I was thinking about my conversation with Matthew, was the different things that drive change. And you drive change by looking at the data, all that kind of analysis we do against the SDGs and the issues on the ground. You drive change by very progressive companies wanting to take the lead on things. And then obviously there's the campaigning and the media side. And for someone like me, this is kind of a double-edged sword, I think, the campaigning that happens outside of the work. But there's no doubt that even when campaigning can be somewhat simplistic, and I think for me and for a lot of the companies, sometimes the campaigning is really simplistic and somewhat frustrating. But it does help remind everybody about what is happening to people's lives and remind people that these issues are real and need to be addressed. And so this is some of the media focus that we've seen on tea. Lots and lots of focus on India. I think somebody said that they might have circulated a video. There are some really ingrained structural, cultural, historical problems across Indian rural communities that are absolutely entrenched in tea as well. And so these are not situations that are unique to tea, but they're absolutely in tea. And so one of the things that we have to do within my organisation is think, well, what role can we play in these very difficult issues? I was telling Henrietta I've been listening to the programme she made around sanitation and gender in India, and I think the stat you kept coming up with was 1 in 3,
yes.
wasn't it?
Yeah.
1 in 3 people don't have access to a usable toilet, and those are the kind of stats that we see in India. In tea communities in India. But if you listen to Henrietta's programme, the number of things you have to do together to actually not only get the infrastructure in, but get it used, maintained, and valued is really tricky.
Yeah.
So you see these kind of, these terrible, terrible pictures on the BBC about these toilets that are, hit the trees falling apart, and that is absolutely there. But as we look at, again, how do we support, the government's Clean India programme coming into tea communities, what it is that needs to be done in terms of support for behavioural change, there's no quick and easy fix there. So walking that line between being very upfront about the problem, but I think companies often find it very difficult if they're held accountable for what is a problem that's much broader. Similarly, actually there's been a lot of focus with the Modern Slavery Act on things like trafficking, and rural communities in India, tea communities included, are places where people can be trafficked out of into quite exploitative situations in cities, and there's been quite a lot of focus on that. And again, trying to figure out whether we can, as a collective, as a partnership, can do something useful, meaningful to change that. As that going back a few years, that was one of the big things that I was trying to figure out. What we have now is quite a long-term partnership now with UNICEF, because if you look at the root causes of these things, it is about opportunity, lack of education. That's what is driving people to think, well, maybe there's maybe there is a better life outside of these rural areas, and then being quite at risk. And so we've had a 3-year partnership with them, which was very, very focused on thinking about how to reduce the risks to adolescent girls in particular. Now we're working more also with adolescent boys who are also at risk. But that goes actually at every level. So we've got people, UNICEF got all sorts of community work happening on the ground. But one of the reasons we chose to work with UNICEF is because they were very engaged in the structures. Because none of this is sustainable. None of this is sustainable unless the Indian institutions are able to do their jobs properly. And UNICEF is very embedded with the Indian government, the Assam government. And so, with this partnership, we feel like we're working with a partner who's working at every single level, and what we can bring in is all the relationships with the tea companies and the tea producers that mean this work can actually operationalise effectively in India. And I visited this project, I've taken some CEOs of member companies out, and we have seen some truly transformational impacts for these girls, and now we're scaling up to a further 3-year programme, which will take us into 205 states. And we think that the impact, the reach will be about 250,000 people, which is massive, but it's only a quarter.
Yes.
It's only a quarter of Assam's tea estates. So you can just see kind of the structural issues that we're dealing with. And I don't expect you to be able to read this, but I think one of the things that we look at, this is what we call the India roadmap, and comes out of a process that we engage with a whole range of tea companies and some other stakeholders about what it would take to get to a thriving, sustainable tea industry. It's what's behind. We've got something similar behind our Malawi roadmap. And whereas in Malawi we kind of feel that we can bring together most of the partners to do probably most of it, in India, I think, because the scale is so big, because the government so much depends on change in policy and change in structure and relationships with government programs, we're looking at which bits can we make a difference in. And one of the things that we struggle with a lot is how to get different kinds and better kinds of engagement with the government on structural and policy issues, because otherwise a lot of these programs will be quite stuck. And then the final thing, just thinking about what we do, is we do try and push the agenda. We do try and use the fact that we were set up as a mission-driven organisation with a lot of influential companies behind us and a lot of expertise to push the agenda. So I love coming to talk to people like yourselves who are moving forward in this space. We are trying to get messages out around things like living income and living wage, which is very difficult for companies to deal with. I can say things as somebody that's not inside a company that companies can't. So it's just also thinking about how we use our external communications and our external influence to push particular learnings that we've had or really help keep the agenda moving. And so that's what I wanted to tell you initially. I will take questions on anything you want to take, but I would really, really also value some interesting debate discussion, because we do feel that we're making a lot of progress in some areas and we're stuck in others, and this whole idea of how do you get new pathways, new ways of doing things, and actually a new conversation on some of these issues is really important.
Brilliant, thank you very much.